Alrighty, so we are on to our week 3, our only learn together this week for the content that we're going to be covering. Okay, so a way important learn together, they all are. I'm sure you probably feel this by now. Hopefully, all this work is starting to gel a little bit for you. So for this learn together, you will have covered all the way to 42. So you'll learn about arrays, you'll learn about manipulating them with methods. There are so many. Learning the documentation couldn't be more helpful when trying to come up with maybe methods that you want to do something that is not shown. Looping. So there's actually two major concepts in this week. One is arrays and one's looping, and they really do go together. Because if you place things into a list, which is basically what an array is, then you need a way to iterate or loop over them. Okay, so let's move to the work that you have for the Learn Together. So now shouldn't be really a big surprise. This kind of makes sense now. Is I want you to take now that we've learned about looping and arrays and have some experience implementing those into your daily decision code. Right, so what we've been working on. So here's my basic requirements, right? So use at least 2 array methods and more really if you want to extend your knowledge. And either a for loop, I should have said loop there, let me just go ahead and fix that. So 2 array methods and then either a for, or a for each loop. So it's 2 kinds of loops here. So a for loop, which we saw him demonstrate, and then the for each loop. And I'm going to use the for each loop in my example, and then output to the browser using the display on page, write about your experience, and then reply to 2 students. Now, part of what I want to say here too is that let's say this, working code is going to be equal to 80 points here, okay? Because that's the important part, is getting that done. And let's just do this. Let's do 85. Is getting the working points based on my requirements, right? So not only does it have to be working, but it has to implement my requirements, and then replies, just because I think I could be more clear here, is worth 15 points, okay? So just FYI. So now let's actually turn to my code. I decided to, and let me just flip over to VS Code, because when you first see this, I'm just going to give you an overview of what I did. Now, the one thing I would say based on our last 2 weeks Thursday item, because in that one we did objects and methods. You don't have to do methods this week, and you don't even have to do objects. You can do arrays and loops without any, but I really like to take what I've learned and figure out a way to use it in my next, because the idea that you're building on your knowledge is really, I think, an important part of this class. So here's what I did. I ended up taking my code and where in Thursday nights, right, I ended up having each day be its own object. And this week, I had an array called data to process, and then each array entry is an object. And in this sense, it is true that this is more real world. And I believe Andrew does talk about this later. Is the idea of using arrays or object of arrays. And so I thought this was a good way for me to implement my code. Now you don't have to do objects as each of your array entries, but I did, because I like the idea of actually having, I keep thinking of an app, and the app is processing my task and giving me back some summary data possibly. So I did a couple things. I set up an array, though, out on the global space that is just an empty array that I'm going to use for some summary data, okay? So just when you look at this, just know that this is true. And now that you know that this is true, I'm going to move over to the browser, Okay, I'm going to move to my code. Here's my output. Okay, so you can see processing record 1. Now we'll see how this is this is done, because hopefully by now you got the idea that an array is 0 indexed. Okay, so let's just go ahead and inspect, and I'll tell you where, based on my code as it is today, where you want to set the breakpoint. And what I have done here is I have a function called process days. Now, the rest of this code is pretty much, again, I went over this idea as I'm using objects inside of my array. But in this case, right, this function is pretty much what you've seen before, but I did change the way it handles the data, which I'll show you. But what I did here is I created a function where I pass in the days. Now, I'll show you how I reference this, because really this days is just these data to process, okay? Kind of abstracting it a little bit. And then at the very end, I ended up writing a delete day just so I'd have a little example to play with based on what I know you're going to get in these search arrays. Because we're not, for Learn Together, going to cover the rest of these concepts. But I definitely recommend the more you can play around with some of these other methods, and we often refer to some of this as higher order functions where they're doing quite a bit. Not necessarily the search, but and actually filter is probably on the border of a higher level function, but it's doing quite a bit in a couple of lines. But my point is that you're not going to get a Learn Together. So let's come back over here. So I at least wrote this function just to play around. But really, here's what I would do. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to set a breakpoint on 96, where I'm going to call process days, which is right here. And I'm going to pass it days to process. And again, I'm going to hit refresh. It's going to stop right there. You can see that in this case, it is an array. And each array, now I shouldn't have, yeah, each array, and you can see there's, the length is 4. We know arrays are 0 index, so it starts with 0. I can see pretty much the data structure I've been using, current time. Now I added day of the week because before that was my object name. Start time, my turn to drive, the name, and then the task, which is just a simple placeholder until I populate that. So what will happen here, and again, step, and so it'll pass that array of objects, again, just an array, into a for each. So what it's going to do is going to look at each, and these are days. So what I do is when and this is a term, this is the new term you learned, which is a callback function. So basically it's saying for each of these, do this to each. Okay, that's what the for each is telling you. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to reference each object, and here you can see this. If I step into it, then the days represent all of the objects in my array. And in this case, each day, and you can see it by row. Again, I definitely recommend stopping this code and doing your best to attempt to see what it's doing. You don't have to completely understand it, but the more time you spend with it, more likely you're going to see what it's doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show on page using that function I've given you, processing record. And now the index is the other thing. This is, for each is going to look at the day, and it's going to give me the index of that. So the index is the place inside the array, and I'm going to add 1 to it because I know arrays are 0 indexed. So when I do this, now I could, because I kind of know what this is already going to do, right? I could just step over this next one. Oh, see, and stepping over outputs it. But because there's not a lot there I wanted to talk about, I just kind of jumped over it by using the step over into next function. So now I'm going to determine time of day by passing, time before Jim, by passing that day, that individual object that I'm looking at by running each of them. So now I'm going to pass this in. I'm going to do step into. And because I'm passing an object, I can then reference the day, because I'm going to, inside of this function, I'm going to say day dot. And it looks very similar to the methods that we used before, but I'm still using objects, but I'm not using method. I just have regular functions. Again, here's no different, but what I'm doing here is I'm actually adding, do I have time? Yeah, so in this case, I'm adding a key value pair into the object called day.time equal whatever I determine the time to be based on if I'm first determining when I'm going, what is the current time, and if I'm driving, separate that time out as well. So I could kind of say, okay, well, let's step into this. Let's just do this. In this case, I'm not returning anything because I'm updating an object. And this is where it's a pass by reference. So it's referencing that individual, the first one. In this case, it's referencing in here that object. So I can do an in place, and this, we kind of call it an in place update. All right, so now determine, again, now I have, not again, but now I can call my next function, passing in day. So this is going to iterate. Let me just go ahead and run it. All right, so what it's going to do is process through each of my days to process. Here we go, right? So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Going to give me output message, tell me which one it's going to process, and then it's going to give me some summary data. Okay, so let's look at the array methods because I didn't really stop it and look at it. So now let's just look at it. So in my determine morning task, instead of just having a string using template strings, I end up setting up tasks to be an array with one entry, because I always know that no matter what happens, I'm going to have coffee in the morning. And then I'm going to say task.push. So I'm going to push in to this array 3 new entries in this based on this condition. Based on this condition, I'm going to push in 1. And based on this condition, I'm going to push in 2 entries. And that's what this push, and then the strings and the comma tell it these are the individual entries you now have in there. Okay, so now I'm going to say day.task. I've set up this variable equal to this array, and now I'm just going to say whatever the day is, then is going to be that day.task, because it was already set up as blank, and now it will be whatever my task, which in this case is an array. Okay, and I'm also going to do a summary, because remember this was a blank array up here, right? Task summary setting out on the global namespace. And I'm going to push day of the week and the total number of tasks. And because I'm using an array to keep the individual task, all I have to do, the total, is say what's the length of that. Okay. And so then I come back here. I'm going to so this comes back. So again, walk through my code, see if you can figure out what it's doing. Ask questions that helps you understand. But basically it's doing kind of what it did last time, except that it's processing, and that's why I like to call it data to process. But I reference it because I know what it is here. It's really the days, and then I iterate over that array of objects, and each object in that array is referenced by day, and then I can pass that day into my functions. Okay, so the more you understand that, the more time you spend walking through the code, it will help you when you go to write your own code. You know that's my goal. All right, so what I did after that, I just decided I would do some summary data, which was show, so each day. And then I did total days, which I just got the length. And then I just showed, so I just showed summary in this case. I'm just looking at, sometimes you have to remember what your own code's doing. Process each, total days to process. So that's this. So this is part of my summary data. Number of tasks per day. And this is where I pass in that array to my show on page. And then I just do a console log of data to process. I say delete day, passing it my array of objects, telling it which day I want you to delete, and then I console log that again. And you can see this because I didn't output it to the page. You can see I passed in 4 because I had Monday through Thursday, and then after I knew it worked because afterwards it had 3. Okay, so I was just testing that code to play with it. Okay, so I know that you're going to have whatever experience. The sooner you work on this, the sooner you can get help. I have just graded your week 2 item, so I'm kind of focused there. The one thing I know that can be a little challenging, especially for students that are new to this, is if your code doesn't run, that means you have some kind of hard error. Let me show you what I mean. So like if I said, if I change the name of this determined day to run, right, and I hit play, well, I'm going to get an error. And that's why you want to have this console showing up, because these hard errors will stop your code execution. Matter of fact, you can see exactly where in mine it stopped that code execution. And that's why if you're trying to walk through code, you don't even get to do that, even though I have a breakpoint, because you had, we call it a hard error, but it's an error that stopped the execution of your code, so you don't see anything happening. And it even shows you right here where it's trying to call determine time before gym, and that's because I changed the name, right? I put now, and that wasn't correct. So these are great because they help you run your code, see if you have errors in your code, and sometimes, well, troubleshooting is just definitely part of what you want to learn in this process. Okay, I hope this helps you. I'll post this, and now I'll go look at our next item, which really is a code along and your most important task so far, which is your develop it. I'll talk to you later.